Welcome to my channel. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to philosophy. Welcome to Aristotle. I don't know why you're here, but welcome. Please make yourself cozy. This is a cozy video. I have my cozy blanket and my cozy beanbag and my cozy red panda. And I also made myself a nice tea. It does kind of sound like someone peeing, but welcome to the reading of the Nicomachean Ethics, translated by J.A.K. Thompson as the Ethics of Aristotle. Currently on my laptop, but in future chapters I hope to be reading it out of the paperback if I get it in time. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm actually doing a YouTube video about Aristotle. This was recommended as the first thing I should read, and I thought if I want to be thorough, I'm going to be thorough. So I'm going to read it. I think I retain information better when I read aloud, so I don't know how long this is going to take me. 314 pages, 10 books. There are timestamps. This is just book 1. PSA, there are a lot of things that I'm going to pronounce incorrectly. Some of them I will look up and some of them I will not. Didn't want to read the introduction, so we're just starting on book 1. Chapter 1. It is thought that every activity, artistic or scientific, in fact, every deliberate action or pursuit, has for its object the attainment of some good. We may therefore assent to the view which has been expressed that the good is that of which all things aim. Since modes of actions involving the practiced hand and the instructed brain are numerous, the number of their ends is proportionately large. For instance, the end of medical science is health, of military science victory, of economic science wealth. All skills of that kind which come under a single faculty, a skill in making bridles or any other part of a horse's gear, comes under the faculty of art of horsemanship, while horsemanship itself in every branch of military practice comes under the art of war. And in like manner, other arts and techniques are subordinate to yet others. In all these, the ends of the master arts are to be preferred to those of the subordinate skills, for it is the former that provide the motive for pursuing the latter. Footnote: it makes no difference if the ends of the activities are the activities themselves, or something over and above these, as in the case of the sciences I have mentioned. Chapter 2. Now, if there is an end which as moral agents we seek for its own sake, and which is the cause of our seeking all the other ends, if we are not to go on choosing one act for the sake of another, thus landing ourselves in an infinite progression with the result that desire will be frustrated and ineffectual, it is clear that this must be the good, that it is the absolutely good. May we not then argue from this that a knowledge of the good is a great advantage to us in the conduct of our lives? Are we not more likely to hit the mark if we have a target? If this be true, we must do our best to get at least a rough idea of what the good really is, and which of the sciences, pure or applied, is concerned with the business of achieving it. Yeah, absolutely. I guess if you know what good is, then you're gonna be able to find a more clear direction for your life. But the perspective that he's lacking is that good is actually all-encompassing, and it's so much more holistic than choosing good over bad. It's more so just living in the duality of it all, I think. Now, most people would regard the good as the end pursued by that study which has the most authority and control over the rest. Need I say that this is the science of politics? It is political science that prescribes what subjects are to be taught in states, which of these different sections of the population are to learn, and up to what point. We see also that the faculties which obtain most regard come under this science. For example, the art of war, the management of property, the ability to state a case. Since, therefore, politics makes use of the other practical sciences and lays it down besides what we must do and what we must not do, its end must include theirs. And that end, in politics as well as in ethics, can only be the good for man. For even if the good of the community coincides with that of the individual, the good of the community is clearly a greater and more perfect good both to get and to keep. This is not to deny that the good of the individual is worthwhile. But what is good for a nation or a city has a higher, a diviner quality. Such being the matters we seek to investigate, the investigation may fairly be represented as the study of politics. I definitely see his point here. Most people would say that overall good for the community and for more people overall would be the most important, but I don't know. I think sometimes selfishness is actually important, and putting yourself first and maybe your own priorities, needs, wants, the good of you first, and then worrying about the community so that you can come from a better place. I don't know, something to think about. In studying the subject, we must be content if we attain as high a degree of certainty as the matter of it admits. The same accuracy or finish is not to be looked for in all discussions, any more than in all the productions of the studio and the workshop. The question of the morally fine and the just, for this is what political science attempts to answer, admits of so much divergence and variation of opinion that it is widely believed that morality is a convention and not part of the nature of things. We find a similar fluctuation of opinion about the character of the good. The reason for this is that quite often good things have hurtful consequences. There are instances of men who have been ruined by their money or killed by their courage, such being the nature of our subject, and such our way of arguing in our discussions of it. We must be satisfied with a rough outline of the truth, and for the same reason we must be content with broad conclusions. Indeed, we must preserve this attitude when it comes to a more detailed statement of the views that are held. It is a mark of the educated man, and a proof of his culture, that in every subject he looks for only so much precision as its nature permits. For example, it is absurd to demand logical demonstrations from a professional speaker. We might as well accept more probabilities from a mathematician. I like that quote, actually. So just reading the room, having discernment, just understanding what you're talking about and who you're talking to about it, and realizing how much accuracy and like how much real common ground you can come to with that person. That's amazing. It is a mark of the educated man and a proof of their culture. Every man is a good judge of what he understands. In special subjects, the specialist over the whole field of knowledge, the man of general culture. This is the reason why political science is not a proper study for the young. The young man is not versed in the practical business of life from which politics draws its premises and its data. He is, besides, swayed by his feelings, with the result that he will make no headway and derive no benefit from a study, the end of which is not knowing, but doing. It makes no difference whether the immaturity is in age or in character. The defect is not due to a lack of years, but to living the kind of life which is a succession of unrelated emotional experiences. To one who is like that, knowledge is as unprofitable as it is to the morally unstable. On the other hand, for those whose desires and actions have a rational basis, a knowledge of these principles of morals must be of great advantage. Chapter 4. To resume, since every activity involving some acquired skill or some moral decision aims at some good, what do we take to be the end of politics? What is the supreme good attainable in our actions? Well, so far as the name goes, there's pretty general agreement. It is happiness, say both intellectuals and the unsophisticated, meaning by happiness, living well or faring well. But when it comes to saying in what happiness consists, opinions differ, and the account given by the generality of mankind is not at all like that given by the philosophers. The masses take it to be something plain and tangible, like pleasure or money or social standing. Some maintain that it is one of these, some that it is another. And the same man will change his opinion about it more than once. When he is caught in illness, he will say that it is health, and when he is hard up, he will say that it is money. Conscious that they are out of their depths in such discussions, most people are impressed by anyone who pontificates and says something that is over their heads. Now, it would no doubt be a waste of time to examine all these opinions. Enough if we consider those which are most in evidence or have something to be said for them. Among these, we shall have to discuss the view held by some that, over and above particular goods like those I have just mentioned, there is another which is good in itself and the cause of whatever goodness there is in all these others. Don't add a digression on method. We must be careful not to overlook the difference that it makes whether we argue from or to first principles. Plato used very properly to advert to this distinction, employing a metaphor from the race course, where the competitors run from their starting point and back to it again. He would ask whether the appropriate procedure in a particular inquiry was from or to first principles. Of course, we must start from what is known, but that is an ambiguous expression, for things are known in two ways. Some are known to us, and some are known absolutely. For members of the Lyceum, there can be little doubt that we must start from what is known to us. So the future students of ethics and politics, if he is to study them to advantage, must have been well brought up. For we begin with the fact, and if there is sufficient reason for accepting it as such, there will be no need to ascertain also the why of the fact. Now, a lad with such an upbringing will have no difficulty grasping the first principles of morals, if he is not in possession of them already. If he has neither of these qualifications, he better take to heart what Hesiod says. That man is best who sees the truth himself. Good, too, is he who hearkens to wise counsel, but who is neither wise himself nor willing to ponder wisdom is not worth a straw. Chapter 5. Let us return from this digression. There is a general assumption that the manner of a man's life is a clue to what he on reflection regards as the good. In other words, happiness. Persons of low tastes, always in the majority, hold that it is pleasure. Accordingly, they ask for nothing better than the sort of life which consists of having a good time. I have in mind the three well-known types of life: that just mentioned, that of the man of affairs, that of the philosophic student. The utter vulgarity of the herd of men comes out in their preference for the sort of existence a cow leads. Their view would hardly get a respectful hearing, were it not that those who occupy great positions sympathize with the monster of sensuality like Sardanapalus. The gentleman, however, and the man of affairs identify the good with honor, which may fairly be described as the end which men pursue in political or public life. Yet honor is surely too superficial a thing to be the good we are seeking. Honor depends more on those who confer than on him who receives it, and we cannot but feel that the good is something personal and almost inseparable from its possessor. Again, why do men seek honor? Surely in order to confirm the favorable opinion they have formed of themselves. It is at all events by intelligent men who know them personally that they seek to be honored. And for what? For their moral qualities? The inference is clear. Public men prefer virtue to honor. It might therefore seem reasonable to suppose that virtue rather than honor is the end pursued in the life of the public servant. But clearly even virtue cannot be quite the end. It is possible, most people think, to possess virtue while you are asleep, to possess it without acting under its influence during any portion of one's life. Besides, the virtuous man may meet with the most atrocious luck or ill treatment, and nobody, who is not arguing for argument's sake, would maintain that a man with an existence of that sort was happy. Footnote: I am absolved from a more detailed discussion of this point by the full treatment it has received in current literature. The third type of life is the contemplative, and this we shall discuss later. As for the life of the businessman, it does not give him much freedom of action. Besides, wealth obviously is not the good we seek, for the sole purpose it serves is to provide the means of getting something else. So far as that goes, the ends we have already mentioned should have a better title to be considered the good, for they are desired on their own account. But in fact, even their claim must be disallowed. We may say that they have furnished the ground for many arguments, and leave the matter at that. I'm not going to read his commentates, sorry. Chapter 6. But we can hardly avoid examining the problem raised by the concept of a universal good. One approaches it with reluctance because the theory of forms was brought into philosophy by friends of mine. Yet surely it is the better, or rather the unavoidable course, above all for philosophers, to defend the truth even at the cost of our most intimate feelings, since, though both are dear, it would be wrong to put friendship before the truth. Those who introduced the theory of forms did not suppose that there existed forms of groups of things in which one of the things is thought of as prior in nature to another. This accounts for their not attempting to construct a form of number as distinct from particular numbers. Now a thing may be called good in three ways: in itself, in some quality it has, in some relation it bears to something else. But the essence of a thing, what it is in itself, is by its very nature prior to any relation it may have, such a relation being an offshoot or accident of it. Therefore there cannot be one form embracing both the absolutely and the relatively good. Again, the word good is used in as many senses as the word is. We may describe a person or a thing, God, for instance, or the reasoning faculty, as good in the sense of absolutely good, or we may speak of things as good when we are thinking of their qualities or special excellences, or we may use the word in connection with the quantity of something, when we mean that there is a right amount of it, or in connection with its relation to something else, as when we say that it is useful, meaning good as means to an end, or in the connection with its occurrence in time, describing it as the right moment, or in connection with its position in space as a good place to live in, and so on. Using technical language, we may predicate good in the categories of substance, quality, quantity, relation, time, space. Clearly, then, good is not something that can be said in one and the same sense of everything called good, for then it cannot be said in all these different senses, but only in one. Again, things of which there is a single form must be things of which there is a single science. Consequently, there should be, if the view we are discussing is right, a single science dealing with all good things. But what do we find? An indefinite number of sciences dealing with the goods coming under even one of the heads we have mentioned. Take the right moment. The right moment in war is studied under military science, the right moment in sickness under the science of medicine. Similarly, the right quantity in diet is considered by medicine, in bodily exercise by physical training. Next, what do they mean by the thing as it really is? The question deserves some answer, for in their own terminology, man, as he really is just another way of saying man. In this respect, then, there will be no difference between them. They are both man. But if we are allowed to argue on these lines, we shall find no difference either between the really good and the good, insofar as both are good. Nor will the really good be any more good by being eternal. You might as well say that a white thing which lasts a long time and is whiter than one which lasts only a day. Footnote: on this point it may be thought that the Pythagoreans have a more probable doctrine. They place unity in their column of goods, but we must leave the discussion of this point to another occasion. To the arguments we have been using, the objection may present itself that the champions of the forms did not mean their words to apply to every good. What they meant, it may be argued, was this: those things, and those things only, which are pursued and desired on their own account, are good. They are good as belonging to one species, while things tending to in any way to produce or conserve them, or to check their opposites, are good in a different way, namely as means of achieving them. Clearly, then, there would be two kinds of goods, things good in themselves and things good as means to these. Let us take them separately. Consider first the things that are good in themselves. Are they called good because they come under a single form? Then what sort of things are the good in themselves? Are they all those things, intelligence, for example, or sight, or certain pleasures and honors, that are sought entirely on their own merits? For these are things which, even if we pursue them with some remoter object in view, might be classified as things good in themselves. Or is there nothing good in itself except the form of the good? That would leave the class empty of content. If, on the other hand, things of the kind I have mentioned do form a class of things good in themselves, it will follow that the same notion of good will be as clearly recognizable in them, and as the same notion of whiteness presents itself to us in snow and in white lead. But when it comes to honor and sagacity and pleasure, the notions we have of them in respect of their goodness are different and distinguishable. Therefore, good is not a general term corresponding to a single form. How then does it happen that these different things are called good? It can hardly be a mere coincidence. Various answers suggest themselves. All goods may derive from a single good, or all may contribute to form a single good. As perhaps the answer may be expressed in an equation: as sight is good in the body, so is rationality in the mind. We could frame a series of such equations, but perhaps it is better to drop the discussion of that point here, since a full examination of it is more suited to another branch of philosophy, and we must follow the same course in dealing with the form of the good. For even if the good, which is predicated of a number of different things, exists only in one element common to them all, or has a separate existence of its own, clearly it cannot be realized in action or acquired by man. Yet it is just a good of that kind that is the subject of our present inquiry. The thought may indeed suggest itself that a knowledge of the absolute good may be desirable as a means of attaining to those goods which a man may acquire and realize in practice. Might we not use it as a pattern to guide us in acquiring a better knowledge of them, a better knowledge of the things that are good for us, and so knowing obtain them? The argument has a certain plausibility, but it manifestly does not accord with the procedure followed by the sciences. For all these aim at some particular good and seek to fill up the gaps in their knowledge of how to attain it. They do not think it any business of theirs to learn the nature of the absolute good. Now it will take some persuading to make us believe that all the masters of technique do not possess, or even make an effort to possess, this knowledge, if it be so powerful an aid to them as it is presented. And there's another puzzle. What advantage in this art will a weaver or a joiner get from a knowledge of the absolute good? Or how shall a doctor or a general who has had a vision of very form become thereby a better doctor or general? As a matter of fact, it does not appear that the doctor makes a study even of health in the abstract. What he studies is the health of the human subject, or rather, of a particular patient, for it is on such a patient that he exercises his skill. It may or may not be the next day, but don't ask questions, please. Chapter 7. From this digression, we may return to the good which is the object of our search. What is it? The question must be asked because goods seem to vary with the art of pursuit in which it appears. It is one thing in medicine and another in strategy, and so in the other branches of human skill. We must inquire, then, what is the good which is the end common to all of them? Shall we say it is that for the sake of which everything else is done? In medicine, this is health; in military science, victory; in architecture, a building, and so on. Different ends in different arts. Every consciously directed activity has an end for the sake of which everything that it does is done. This end may be described as its good. Consequently, if there be some one thing which is the end of all things consciously done, this will be the doable good. Or, if there be more than one end, then it will be all of these. Thus, the ground on which our argument, this end may be described as its good. If there be more than one end, then it will be all of these. Thus, the ground on which our argument proceeds is shifted, but the conclusion arrived at is the same. I must try, however, to make my meaning clearer. In our actions, we aim at more ends than one. That seems to be certain. But since we choose some, wealth, for example, or flutes and tools or instruments generally, as means to something else, it is clear that not all of them are ends in the full sense of the word, whereas the good, that is the supreme good, is surely an end. Assuming, then, that there is some one thing which alone is an end beyond which there are no further ends, we may call that the good of which we are in search. If there be more than one such final end, the good will be that end which has the highest degree of finality. An object pursued for its own sake possesses a higher degree of finality than one pursued with an eye to something else. A corollary to that is that a thing which is never chosen as a means to some remoter object has a higher degree of finality than things which are chosen both as ends in themselves and as means to such ends. We may conclude, then, that something which is always chosen for its own sake, and never for the sake of something else, is, without qualifications, a final end. Now, happiness more than anything else appears to be just such an end, for we always choose it for its own sake, and never for the sake of some other thing. It is different with honor, pleasure, intelligence, and good qualities generally. We choose them indeed for their own sake in the sense that we should be glad to have them, irrespective of any advantage which might accrue from them. But we also choose them for the sake of our happiness, in the belief that they will be instrumental in promoting that. On the other hand, nobody chooses happiness as a means of achieving them, or anything else whatsoever than just happiness. That is true. I find that for a lot of people, myself included, happiness is an end goal, and I think a lot of what we do is in pursuit of that. The same conclusion would seem to follow from another consideration. It's a generally accepted view that the final good is self-sufficient. By self-sufficient is meant not what is sufficient for oneself living the life of a solitary, but includes parents, wife and children, friends, and fellow citizen in general. For a man is a social animal. Footnote, of course, we must draw the line somewhere, for if we stretch it to include ancestors and descendants and friends as friends, there will be no end to it, but there will be an opportunity of considering this point. A self-sufficient thing, then, we take to be one which on its own footing tends to make life desirable and lacking in nothing, and we regard happiness as such a thing. Add to this that we regard it as the most desirable of all things without having it counted in some other desirable thing. For, if such an addition were possible, clearly we should regard it as more desirable when even the smallest advantage was added to it, for the result would be an increase in the number of advantages, and the larger sum of advantages is preferable to the smaller. Happiness, then, the end to which all our conscious acts are directed, is found to be something final and self-sufficient. But no doubt people will say, to call happiness the highest good is a truism. We want a more distinct account of what it is. We might arrive at this if we could grasp what is meant by the function of a human being. If we take a flautist or a sculptor or any craftsman, in fact any class of man at all, who have some special job or profession, we find that his special talent and excellence comes out in that job, and this is his function. The same thing will be true of man simply as man. That is, of course, if man does have a function. But is it likely that joiners and shoemakers have certain functions or specialized activities, while man as such has none, but has been left by nature a functionless being? Seeing that eye and hand and foot and every one of our members has some obvious function, must we not believe that in like manner a human being has a function over and above these particular functions? And what exactly is it? The mere act of living is not peculiar to man. We find it even in the vegetable kingdom, and what we are looking for is something peculiar to him. We must therefore exclude from our definition the life that manifests itself in mere nurture and growth. A step higher should be that life that is confined to experiencing sensations, but that we see is shared by horses, cows, and the brute creation as a whole. We are left, then, with a life concerning which we can make two statements. First, it belongs to the rational part of man. Secondly, it finds expression in actions. The rational part may be either active or passive. Passive insofar as it follows the dictates of reason. Active insofar as it possesses and exercises the power of reasoning. A similar distinction can be drawn within the rational life. That is to say, the reasonable element in it may be active or passive. Let us take it that what we are concerned with here is the reasoning power in action. For it will be generally allowed that when we speak of reasoning, we really mean exercising our reasoning faculties. This seems the more correct use of the word. Now let us assume for the moment the truth of the following propositions. A. The function of a man is the exercise of his non-corporeal faculties, or soul, in accordance with, or at least not divorced from, a rational principle. B. The function of an individual, and of a good individual in that same class, a harp player, for example, and a good harp player, and so through the classes, is generically the same, except that we must add superiority in accomplishment to the function of the harp player being merely to play on the harp, while the function of the good harp player is to play on it well. C. The function of man is a certain form of life, namely an activity of the soul exercised in a combination with a rational principle or reasonable ground of action. D. The function of a good man is to exert such activity well. E. A function is performed well when performed in accordance with the excellence proper to it. If these assumptions are granted, we conclude that the good for man is an activity of soul in accordance with goodness, or in accordance with the best and the most complete form of goodness. There is another condition of happiness. It cannot be achieved in less than a complete lifetime. One swallow does not make a summer, neither does one fine day. And one day, or indeed any brief period of felicity, does not make a man entirely and perfectly happy. It is not pretended that we have given more than an outline of the good, but we must be content with that at this stage, for doubtless the proper way of going to work is to draw an outline and fill in the details afterwards. When the sketch is well done, anybody can finish the picture. In this work, time is believed to put his shoulder to the wheel and even point the way to new discoveries. In fact, progress in the arts has usually been made in that fashion, for anybody can fill in the gaps in a formula. But we must not forget what we said before about not looking for the same exactness in all the study or we study or labor at, but only as much as the subject matter in each case allows, or is appropriate to the particular method followed by the student or workman. For example, the carpenter and the geometrician alike try to find the right angle, but they do it in different ways, the carpenter being content with such precision as satisfies the requirement of his job, the geometrician, as a student of scientific truth, seeking to discover the nature and attributes of the right angle. We ought to follow this procedure in other studies as well, always asking ourselves what degree of accuracy is to be expected in them, in order that we may not unnecessarily complicate the facts by introducing side issues. Nor must we demand in every subject an account of the cause or reason why it is what it is, for there are cases in which it is quite enough if the fact itself is proved. We shall find that this applies to beginnings, which is the name for first principles. In them, the fact is the beginning. Some are grasped by a process of induction, some by a kind of perception, some at the end of a period of training or habituation, others in other ways. On every occasion we must seek to arrive at the first principles in the way natural to them, in the instance that presents itself. We must also make a point of finding good definitions of them, because such definitions are an immense advantage to us as we pursue the subject. The proverb says that the half is greater than the whole, but we may go further and say that the beginning is greater than the whole, for the beginning clears up many obscurities together in the matter we may be investigating. Chapter 8. So we must examine our first principle, not only logically, that is, as a conclusion from premises, but also in the light of what is currently said about it. For if a thing be true, the evidence will be found in harmony with it, and if it be false, the evidence is quickly shown to be discordant with it. But first a note about goods. They have been classified as A, external, B, of the soul, C, of the body. Of these, we may express our belief that goods of the soul are the best and are most properly designated as good. Now, according to our definition, happiness is an expression of the soul in considered actions, and that definition seems to be confirmed by this belief, which is not only an old popular notion, but is accepted by philosophers. We are justified, too, in saying that the end consists in certain acts or activities, for this enables us to count it among goods of the soul and not among external goods. We may also claim that our description of the happy man as the man who lives or fares well chimes in with our definition, for happiness has pretty much been stated to be a form of such living or faring well. Again, our definition seems to include the elements detected in the various analysis of happiness: virtue, practical wisdom, speculative wisdom, or a combination of these, or one of them in more or less intimate association with pleasure. All these definitions have their supporters, while still others are for adding material prosperity to the conditions of a happy life. Some of these views are popular convictions of long standing, others are set forth by a distinguished minority. It is reasonable to think that neither the mass of men nor the sages are mistaken altogether, but that on this point or that, or indeed on most points, there is justice in what they say. Now, our definition of happiness as an activity in accordance with virtue is so far in agreement with that of those who say it is virtue, that such an activity involves virtue. But of course it makes a great difference whether we think of the highest good as consisting in the possession or in the exercise of virtue. It is possible for a disposition to goodness to exist in a man without anything coming of it. He might be asleep or in some other way have ceased to exercise his function of a man. But that is not possible with the activity in our definition, for in doing well the happy man will of necessity do. Just as the Olympic Games, it is not the best looking or the strongest men present who are crowned with victory, but competitors, the successful competitors. So in the arena of human life, the honors and rewards fall to those who show their good qualities in action. Observe, moreover, that the life of the actively good is inherently pleasant, is a psychological experience, and every man finds that pleasant for which he has a liking. Fond of so-and-so is the expression people use. For example, a horse is a source of pleasure to a man who is fond of horses, a show to a man who is fond of sightseeing. In the same way, just actions are a source of pleasure to a man who likes to see justice done, and good actions in general to one who likes goodness. Now, the mass of men do not follow any consistent plan in the pursuit of their pleasures, because their pleasures are not inherently pleasurable, but men of more elevated tastes and sentiments find pleasure in things which are in their own nature pleasant, for instance, virtuous actions. So their life does not need to have pleasure fastened about it like a necklace, but possesses it as a part of itself. We may go further and assert that he is no good man who does not find pleasure in noble deeds. Nobody would admit that a man is just, unless he takes pleasure in just actions, or liberal, unless he takes pleasure in acts of liberality. And so with the other virtues. Grant this, and you must grant that virtuous actions are a source of pleasure in themselves, and surely they are also both good and noble, and that always in the highest degree, if we are to accept, as accept we must, the judgment of the good man about them, he judging in the way I have described. Thus, happiness is the best, the noblest, the most delightful thing in the world, and in it meet all those qualities which are separately enumerated in the inscription upon the temple at Delos. Justice is loveliest, and health is best, and sweetest to obtain is heart's desire. All those good qualities inhere in the activities of the virtuous soul, and it is these, or the best of them, which we say constitute happiness. For all that those are clearly right who, as I remarked, maintain the necessity to a happy life of an addition in the form of material goods. It is difficult, if not impossible, to engage in noble enterprises without money to spend on them. Many can only be performed through friends, or wealth, or political influence. There are also certain advantages, such as the possessions of honored ancestors or children, or personal beauty, the absence of which takes the bloom from our felicity. For you cannot quite regard a man as happy if he be very ugly to look at, or of humble origin, or alone in the world and childless, or, what is probably worse, with children or friends who have not a single good quality or those virtues died with them. Well, as I said, happiness seems to require a modicum of external prosperity, thus leading some to identify it with the condition of those who are favorites of fortune. Okay, I actually like this commentary by the translator. He said, however, we must guard against misunderstanding. Fortune can supply the happy man with the means and create for him the conditions of his happiness. It cannot create his happiness. I actually completely disagree with Aristotle here. I don't think if you're ugly, you can't be happy, or if you don't have a lot of money, or if you're childless, or I don't think those things necessarily can take away your happiness. I think happiness is a constant choice. But of course, yes, having money can supply the happy man with the means. So there is something to say about accessibility. Chapter 9. From this springs another problem. Is happiness, A, capable of being acquired by some intellectual process, or the information of a habit, or some other method of training? Or B, does it come to us simply by some divine dispensation, or even by the caprice of events? Well, in the first place, if anything is a gift of the gods to men, it is reasonable to suppose that happiness is such a gift, particularly as of all human possessions it is the best. Footnote. This, however, is a topic which appears more germane to another branch of study, such as theology. Yet, even if happiness is not sent by a special providence, but is acquired by virtue or study or practice, we look on it as one of our greatest blessings. For the crown and the end of goodness is surely of all things the best, and the best we may also call divine and blissful. In the second place, we look on happiness as something that may be widely spread. For, through some process of study or application or our mental powers, it may fall to any man who does not suffer from some disability or incapacity to achieve excellence. Thirdly, assuming that it is a better thing to reach happiness by these efforts of our own than by a stroke of luck, we may reasonably think that happiness is in fact reached in that way. The productions of nature have an innate tendency in the direction of the best condition of which they are capable, and so have the creations of the craftsman and artist, and whatever has an efficient cause of any kind, especially if that cause ranks higher in the scale of excellence. But that the greatest and finest thing of all should be at the mercy of chance is a thought that strikes a very jarring note. The problem may receive some illumination from our description of happiness as an activity of the soul, all the other good things of life being either necessary adjuncts of happiness or useful in helping it to perform its function in the way that tools are helpful to the workman. The conclusion that happiness depends upon ourselves is in harmony with what I said in the first of these lectures. When I laid it down that the highest good is the end which is sought by political science, what the statesman is most anxious to produce is a certain moral character in his fellow citizens, namely a disposition to virtue and the performance of virtuous actions. That is why we do not naturally speak of a cow or a horse or other beasts as happy, for none of the brute creation can take part in moral activities. For the same reason, no child is happy either, for its age precludes it from taking part as yet in such actions. If we choose to call one happy, it is because he gives promise of being so. For, as I have already observed, we cannot have happiness unless we have complete goodness in a complete lifetime. Life is full of chances and changes, and by the most prosperous of men may in the evening of his days meet with great misfortunes. Like Priam in the stories we read in the epic poems, a man who has encountered such blows of fate and suffered a tragic death is called happy by no one. Chapter 10. Must we go further and call no man happy as long as he is alive? Must we, in Solon's phrase, look to the end? And, if we feel bound to accept this dictum, are we committed to the further admission that a man may be happy when he is dead? Surely that is a paradox if ever there was one, especially for us whose very definition of happiness makes it out to be a form of activity. On the other hand, if we deny the possibility of happiness for the dead, if Solon's words mean something else, namely that only when he is dead is it safe to call a man happy, as one beyond the arrows of outrageous fortune, even this does not meet all the difficulties involved in the question, for a dead man is popularly believed to be capable of experiencing both good and ill, honor and dishonor, prosperity and the loss of it among his children and descendants generally, in exactly the same way as if he were alive but unaware or unobservant of what was happening. But this raises another question. Suppose a man had lived an exceptionally happy life and was no less happy in his death. Many vicissitudes of fortune may overtake his descendants, some of whom may be good and enjoy such a life as the good deserve, while others may be bad and fare badly. Is the dead man, then, to change with all their changes and become happy at one time and unhappy at another? It seems unlikely, to say the least, yet it would also be an odd position to maintain that ancestors are not affected at all, even for a moment, by the ups and downs of the family fortunes. Suppose we go back to the question whether a man can be happy while he is still alive, for perhaps the solution of that will help us in our study of this problem about ancestors and descendants. If we are to look at the end and call a dead man happy, not because he is, but because he was so, how absurd it will be not to tell the truth about him when he actually is happy, for no better reason than this, that we are not prepared to call the living happy because of the chopping and changing of fortune, and because we have got into our heads that happiness is something permanent and hard to change. Although, in fact, the wheel of fortune is often turned full circle for the same people. Don't you see that, if we go by this, we shall often have to call the same person now happy and now miserable? That is to make the happy man a chameleon and a lodger in a tumble-down house. I suggest that in following these changes of fortune we are getting off the straight path. Our happiness or unhappiness is not bound up with them. They are only, as I said, the inevitable concomitants of human life. It's the direction of the soul's energies on sound moral principles that make us happy, their direction toward evil that make us unhappy. Now, the point we have raised in this discussion is further evidence in support of our definition, since the virtuous activities have a permanence denied to the rest, for it will be agreed that they last longer in the mental exertion demanded by the special sciences. And among these activities themselves, the degree of permanence is in proportion to their intrinsic value. This appears from the circumstance that it is in them that those who enjoy true felicity are most deeply and continuously engaged, and this no doubt accounts for the fact that these higher activities do not let us forget them. We conclude, then, that the happy man will have that desideratum of permanence in his happiness. In fact, will be happy throughout his whole existence. For to do and to contemplate what is in conformity with goodness is the chief or the only business in his life, and he will take what fortune sends him in the finest spirit and in exactly the right way as being, in the words of Simonides, good in very truth, and foursquare without a flaw. Yet the accidents of fortune are many, though they vary in importance. Little bits of good or bad luck clearly do not much affect the balance of our happiness in life. On the other hand, repeated strokes of good fortune cannot, if considerable, fail to increase that happiness, since they must inevitably add to the brilliance of life, and they can be used to fine and lofty ends. But great misfortunes coming in battalions crush and maim our felicity in two ways, by inflicting pain and by putting a check on most of our activities. For all that, even in our calamities, the beauty of the soul shines out when a man bears with composure one heavy mischance after another, not because he does not feel them, but because he is a man of high and heroic temper. Besides, if it be true, as I affirmed, that the quality of life is determined by its activities, it is impossible for the entirely happy man to become miserable, for he will never be guilty of base or detestable actions. The truly good and wise man, we are convinced, bears with dignity all that fortune sends him, and invariably takes the most honorable line of conduct that is open to him in the circumstances. Just as a good general employs the forces at his disposal in the most scientific way, and the shoemaker makes the neatest shoe out of the leather given him by the customer, and so with all other craftsmen whatsoever. This being so, never can the happy man become unhappy, though doubtless he can hardly be supposed to enjoy supreme felicity if his woes should rival those of Priam, and surely he will not be full of change and mutability. It will be no easy matter to dislodge him from his happiness, nor will everyday mishaps effect this. It will need a succession of hard blows, from which it will take him a long time to recover and be happy again. Indeed, if he recovers at all, it will only be at the end of a protracted period in the course of which he has had every opportunity of winning great and shining prizes for his renewed endeavors. We are now in a position to describe the happy man as one who realizes in action a goodness that is complete and that is adequately furnished with external goods, and that not for some limited period, but throughout a fully rounded life spent in that way. And perhaps we must add to our definition one who shall live in this way, and whose death shall be consistent with his life. For the future is dark to us, and happiness we maintain to be an end, and in every way final and complete. If this be so, then those who have or shall have the blessings we have enumerated shall be pronounced by us entirely happy in terms of human happiness. Chapter 11. The notion that the dead are not touched at all by the fortunes of their descendants or any of their friends has a chilling effect on us and is generally repudiated. But the subject is a perplexed one in consequence of the number and variety of the things that happen to us, some of which come home to us more than others. To distinguish between them individually is a business of endless length, so we shall have to be content with a broad statement of a general character. This embraces two affirmations. 1. The misfortunes of our friends of whatever degree, just like those which happen to ourselves, have sometimes a weighty influence upon our lives, and sometimes appear to be comparatively trifling. 2. It makes a great difference whether a particular misfortune befalls men while they are living or after they are dead. A far greater difference than it makes in a tragedy whether the grim and lawless deeds precede the action or are performed in the course of it. It is a difference we must take into our reckoning. Still more, perhaps, the problem of whether the dead participate in any forms of good or evil. For the obvious inference from what we have been saying is that, if any sense of good or evil penetrates to their consciousness at all, it must be a weak and slight one, either in itself or as they feel it. Slight, or at any rate not of such force and quality as to make the unhappy happy, or to rob the happy of their happiness. Chapter 12. Now, after settling these questions, let us see if we can discover whether happiness is something to be praised or something to be valued. One thing is clear, it is not a mere potentiality of good. By a thing to be praised, we evidently mean always something that is commended for a certain quality it has, or a certain relation which it bears to something else. Thus we praise the just and the brave and the good and goodness generally on the strength of what they do or produce. In like manner, we praise the strong and the swift and so on the ground of their possessing certain native gifts and standing in a certain relation to something good and excellent. Another way of apprehending the truth of this is to think of praise addressed to the gods. Praise is relative, and if the gods are praised, it can only be in comparison with us mortals. This shows that to praise them is a manifest absurdity. Since praise is of things capable of being related to other things, it is clear that the supremely good things call not for praise, but for something greater and better. As plainly appears in the case of the gods, whom we are content to call happy or blessed, an epithet we apply also to such men as most closely resemble the gods. We see that it is so also with things that are good. No one praises happiness as he praises justice. No, we think it something more divine and higher in the scale of values. Hence, Eudoxus is held to have made a good point in his plea for awarding the first prize to pleasure when he adduced the following argument. The fact that pleasure, which is one of the things recognized as good, is not praised is evidence that it is superior to the goods that are praised, and this character, he thought, belongs also to God and to the supreme good, which is a standard to which all other goods are referred. While praise is given to goodness, for goodness is the inspiration to noble actions, panegyric or encomiums are bestowed on the high deed done, whether bodily feat or intellectual achievement. We must, however, leave the detailed examination of the subject to those who have made a special study of the encomium, for no doubt it is more in their line than in ours. But so far as we are concerned, the arguments that have been adduced must have convinced us that happiness is one of those things that are perfect and beyond praise. We might infer as much from the consideration that it is a first principle, as is proved by the fact that everything we do is done with a view to it, and we regard it as fundamental that the first principle and cause of the things called good should be something above price and divine. Chapter 13. Happiness, then, being an activity of the soul in conformity with perfect goodness, it follows that we must examine the nature of goodness. When we have done this, we should be in a better position to investigate the nature of happiness. There is this, too. The genuine statesman is thought of a man who has taken peculiar pains to master this problem, desiring as he does to make his fellow citizens good men obedient to the laws. Now, if the study of moral goodness is a part of political science, our inquiry into its nature will clearly follow the lines laid down in our preliminary observations. Well, the goodness we have to consider is human goodness. This, I mean human goodness, or, if you prefer to put it that way, human happiness, was what we set out to find. By human goodness is meant not fineness of physique, but a right condition of the soul, and by happiness a condition of the soul. That being so, it is evident that the statesman ought to have some inkling of psychology, just as the doctor who is to specialize in diseases of the eye must have a good general knowledge of physiology. Indeed, such a general background is even more necessary for the statesman in view of the fact that his science is of a higher order than the doctor's. Now, the best kind of doctor takes a good deal of trouble to acquire a knowledge of the human body as a whole. Therefore, the statesman should also be a psychologist and study the soul with an eye to his profession. Yet he will do so only as far as his own problems make it necessary. To go into greater detail on the subject would hardly be worth the labor spent on it. Psychology has been studied elsewhere, and some of the doctrines stated there may be accepted as adequate for our present purpose and used by us here. The soul is represented as consisting of two parts, a rational and an irrational. As regards to the irrational part, there is one subdivision of it which appears to be common to all living things, and this we may designate as having a vegetative nature, by which I mean that it is the cause of nutrition and growth, since one must assume the existence of such vital force in all things that assimilate food. Now the excellence peculiar to this power is evidently common to the whole of animated nature and not confined to man. This view is supported by the admitted fact that the vegetative part of us is particularly active in sleep, when the good and the bad are hardest to distinguish. Footnote. Hence the saying, for half their lives no man is happier than another. Such a phenomenon would be only natural, for sleep is a cessation of that function of the operation, of which depends the goodness or badness of the soul. But enough of this. Let us say no more about the nutritive part of the soul, since it forms no portion of goodness in the specifically human character. But there would seem to be another constituent of the soul, which, while irrational, contains an element of rationality. It may be observed in the type of man we call continent and incontinent. They have a principle, a rational element in their souls, which we commend, because it encourages them to perform the best actions in the right way. But such natures appear at the same time to contain an irrational element in active opposition to the rational. In paralytic cases, it often happens that when the patient wills to move his limbs to the right, they swing instead to the left. Exactly the same thing may happen to the soul. The impulses of the incontinent man carry him in the opposite direction from that towards which he was aiming. The only difference is that, where the body is concerned, we see the uncontrolled limb, while the erratic impulse we do not see. Yet this should not prevent us from believing that besides the rational, an irrational principle exists running opposite and counter to the other. Yet, as I said, it is not altogether irrational. At all events, it submits to direction in the continent man. and may be assumed to be still more amenable to reason in the temperate and in the brave man, in whose moral makeup there is nothing which is at variance with reason. We have then this clear result. The irrational part of the soul, like the soul itself, consists of two parts. The first of these is the vegetative, which has nothing rational about it at all. The second is that from which spring the appetites and desire in general, and this does in a way participate in reason, seeing that it is submissive and obedient to it. That the irrational element in us need not be heedless of the rational is proved by the fact that we find admonition, indeed every form of censure and exhortation, not ineffective. It may be, however, that we ought to speak of the appetitive part of the soul as rational too. In that event, it will rather be the rational part that is divided in two, one division rational in the proper sense of the word and in its nature, the other in the derivative sense in which we speak of a child as listening to reason in the person of its father. These distinctions within the soul supply us with a classification of the virtues. Some are called intellectual, as wisdom, intelligence, prudence. Others are moral, as liberality and temperance. When we are speaking of a man's character, we do not describe him as wise or intelligent, but as gentle or temperate. Yet we praise a wise man too, on the ground of his disposition, or settled habit of acting wisely. The dispositions so praised are what we mean by virtues. Wow. All right. We done did it.